Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Right, it's episode 290, and finally we're getting into commercial property. Now this is a beginner's guide, but don't worry if you're a novice, because by the end of this episode, we're going to teach you everything from what is commercial property to how to get started.
Yes, thank you for joining us once again for the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors just like you come together to get informed and inspired. Today we're taking you into brand new territory that you might not be familiar with. It's going to be interesting, and if you know nothing about commercial property, you're going to learn a lot. And you'll be wanting to make sure that you stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we give you that little bit more.
So it's our news story of the week, and there's plenty to talk about this week because of good old friends, the government, have started throwing around more policies. And Theresa May, in particular, has an idea. She wants to tax overseas property investors a little bit more. And she wants to do that via stamp duty. She wants to charge overseas investors between 1% and 3% extra on top of the already quite aggressive stamp duty to maybe put people off or at least make them think twice. And bless her, Rob, she's going to give all the money to the homeless.
Yeah, very kind of her. Interesting one, this, because we were talking about this just a few weeks ago when we were talking about how New Zealand has restricted foreign property ownership. And I think we were saying as part of that, it's funny how nothing's really been done here, because it seems like quite an easy political point to score. We know that in London in particular, lots of properties are bought by overseas buyers. So if you're trying to damp down demand for housing, if you can restrict that market, it's probably politically quite an easy way of doing it because the domestic population isn't particularly going to object. Lo and behold, a few weeks later, that's what's happened. As usual, when things are announced, particularly at conferences, details are very scarce on this. So it's between 1% and 3%. We don't know if that's ramping up over time or if they haven't decided yet or what's going on. And we don't really know how they're defining foreign. So in particular, Rob, I'm thinking about expats here. So if you're an expat, you're not resident in the UK for tax purposes, but you buy the property through a UK company, would you have to pay this extra stamp duty in that situation? I just can't figure it out.
No, and as you said, Rob, there's no detail, which is typical. They like to spook a market or at least stir it up a bit with little to no information. So you can make your own mind up. I don't know how they'd implement it if it was bought through limited companies. I'm sure they have given it loads of thought. We will see. If it does come in, what you can expect is a little mini surge in the market like we saw last time stamp duty was increased for buy-to-let investors, because there'll be a lot of people overseas and possibly expats, if it affects them, that will want to get in before these rises. So there may be a little boost to the market if this does take place. And final comment, the little bit about giving the money to the homeless. Well, it's got absolutely nothing to do with overseas buyers, but quite a nice play there by the government to try and make you think they're linked. And also, if they hadn't taken away funding in the first place, then they probably wouldn't need to give them extra money. But let's not get political. Just pees me off a bit, but at least I've got most of my anger out pre-recording.
Now, today is a very special day. If you're a regular Property Podcast listener, you should know why that is. It's the first Thursday of the month, and that means it is Meetup Day. Across the UK and beyond, property investors are meeting up to swap ideas and information and get to know each other and generally chat about property with people who aren't going to look bored after a couple of minutes. If you're going along, have a great time. And if you haven't booked your place yet, it's not too late. If you're listening to the Property Podcast on the day it comes out, which you always should, all you need to do is go to thepropertyhub.net/meetups. You can find your nearest, you can book your place, it's completely free.
Now it's episode 290 and we're doing the beginner's guide to commercial property. Why? Well, truthfully, we're not experts. But as we're approaching episode 300, we felt that was wrong. And we know so many of you are interested in commercial property. So good old Rob D has got his textbooks out, spoke to his contacts, and basically gemmed up for this episode so we can deliver you a beginner's guide. We are not going to deliver you expert advice, but we can give you the basics. So by the end of this podcast, you'll be able to hold a decent conversation around commercial property.
Yeah, so if you know nothing at all, then in 15 minutes or so, you'll know something. So we're going to start with the most beginnery question there is, which is worth answering though. What is commercial property? Well, the very basic definition is it's any property that's occupied for the purpose of running a business. And that's typically divided up into a few different sectors. So you've got retail, you've got offices, you've got industrial, and then you've got leisure, which is hotels and things like that. So it's any property that's occupied for the purpose of running a business. Now, where people sometimes get confused is they confuse commercial property with buying residential property with a commercial mortgage. So in some situations, for example, when you're buying an HMO, you might get a commercial mortgage, but that doesn't make it commercial property. It's the terms of the loan that's different, but the property is still a residential property, therefore it's not commercial property. So that's the dividing line, but they can be mixed. So you can get property where there's a residential element as well. So very commonly, you'll get a shop unit with a flat above it. And when that happens, it's called mixed use property.
Now, if you've had a bit of a look at commercial property previously, you may have seen things like A1, B1, B2, and that's not how well they've done at school or their grades. It's actually the class they're in because it relates to the type of commercial property it is. So let's run through what they are. A1 is shops. So if you see anything with A1, it's a shop. A3 is restaurants and cafes, as my son tries to tell me. Offices is B1. B2 is industrial, and it goes on. There's more, but they're probably the most common. A1, A3, B1, B2. They're probably the ones you'll see the most. Shops, restaurants, offices, industrial. Now, you can't go in and take an office, for example, a B1, and decide you want to put a restaurant in there. You have to get planning permission to change the class. You can't just decide that, well, it's commercial, so I want to use it for a different type of commercial and get on with it. You actually have to go through planning to change that, and it may not be granted. The local authority may be really keen to see more restaurants, but it could be the case that they are aggrieved to see any more offices go because so many have been converted. So don't just assume you can do it. You'll need to do a bit of research there before.
So that's the basic overview of what commercial property is. We've defined it now. One thing that's really interesting is who owns commercial property. And this is something that I knew before doing the research for this, but I didn't quite realise the extent to which this was the case, which is that only 15% of commercial property is owned by individuals. Overseas investors, funnily enough, who we were just talking about, own 29% of commercial property, and that includes sovereign wealth funds who own quite a lot. And then a large chunk of it is owned by domestic, corporate or financial vehicles. So you've got funds, collective investment schemes, REITs, which we talked about on the podcast a tiny bit before. They own some of it. Then you've got pension funds and insurance companies who own a lot of commercial property as well. We'll talk a bit later about why it's attractive to institutional investors in particular. But for now, it's just worth knowing that most residential property is not owned by individuals. But that doesn't mean that as an individual, you can't own commercial property. You absolutely can. And we're going to talk about how to do that later on.
So how does it differ from residential? I mean, they're both buildings, right? But actually, after them both being in buildings that are built by the same materials, residential and commercial are really, really different. And again, it's probably one of the reasons why we haven't covered it so much. One key difference, and this may be a reason why there's not that many individuals who invest in the commercial property or don't have the confidence to, is that it's far more vulnerable to the economy. When a crash happens, commercial property tends to be hit harder a lot more. So last time round, after 2008, commercial property fell by 35%, which is significantly more than the residential market. However, it's recovered really well, faster than most residential markets as well. In an economy that's on a downward spiral, commercial is hit quite severely. But the same goes for when the economy's doing really well, commercial values shoot upwards.
Another reason why it's less common with individual investors is that the transaction sizes are just bigger. So if you're thinking about like a lock-up garage or a flat above a shop, you can get commercial property of that type that costs you less than 100k in some situations. But for the most part, because the buildings are bigger, just really simplistically, transaction sizes are bigger too. So office blocks, industrial parks, shopping centres, they can cost hundreds of millions of pounds. And purely for that reason, for most of us, owning most types of commercial property is beyond our means. But there are ways of getting exposure to that type of property, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later on.
One of the big reasons that these institutions and other investors are attracted to commercial property is the lease lengths. The tenancies are so much longer. An average new lease on a commercial property is 7 years, which is a nice length of time to lock in an income. And depending on the type of tenant, you pretty much know you're guaranteed. For example, if Tesco's go bankrupt, then the whole country's got bigger problems than you're not getting your rent. So if you've got a big tenant in there, you can have that confidence that you're always going to get paid. And landlords are protected further that any tenant that moves in needs to repair it and leave it in its original condition. So if Tesco's take a unit from you, they'll fit it out, often fully at their cost. Then, when they return it back to you, they have to strip it back to its original condition and give it back to you almost as good as new again. So you can see why this is attractive to commercial landlords. Word of caution though, voids can be a lot longer. I've seen this myself recently. We're about to open an office in Manchester. When I was looking at some office spaces, I would ask, like, oh, so how long's it been empty? And sometimes the answer was like 9 months, a year. And that can be for a couple of reasons. One, it can be lack of demand, but also it could be the landlord is holding out for a particular price and lease length, because that can affect the value of the property.
Yeah, and the way that commercial property is valued is really interesting as well, and very different from residential property. So when you're looking at a normal residential property, you're thinking about the rent that you can get, you're looking at the yield and the ROI, and you're thinking about capital growth as well. There's a lot of different factors in making up your decision, but the value, how much you pay, is determined by comparables. So when someone comes around to value the residential property that you're thinking of buying, yes, they'll look at the rent that you could get for it, but that's not the main factor. What they'll do is find similar properties nearby that are an equivalent size and type, and they'll use that to estimate how much the property is worth. With commercial property, the whole valuation is based around the rent, or more precisely, on the future cash flows that the property is going to generate. So what a valuer will do is they'll look at the rent that's being paid, they'll look at the length of the lease, so how long that rent is guaranteed to be paid for, and they'll factor in the security of that income. So like Rob just talked about, a major supermarket is more likely to pay its rent than a sole trader, so they won't need to discount that cash flow for any potential lost rent. Once that income stream's been determined, a buyer will then pay a multiple of that gives them the yield that they want. So, for example, say that a particular buyer is happy with a yield of 5% and the rent that they're getting or think they can get is £50,000 a year. That means that they would pay 20 times that £50,000, meaning they pay £1 million for that property. So they're not looking around at what other buildings are worth, they're basing it purely on the cash flow. What that means is that the main drivers of the value of commercial property are rent levels. If rents go up, then that pushes up the price of property, and if they go down, that pushes the values down. And it depends on the yields that investors are willing to accept. So if investors go from being happy with a 5% yield to now wanting an 8% yield, that's going to push the actual capital value of the building down. And the yield that they're willing to accept depends on various factors as well, such as the cost of finance, their future expectations, and the returns that they could make in other asset classes if they invested there instead. So with the value of property being dependent on the income, that's very, very different from residential property. And that focus on income is one clue as to why commercial property is attractive to certain types of buyer.
So this really leads us into why would you own a commercial property? Why would you consider doing this instead of or alongside residential property? Well, as a long-term institutional investment, it's attractive because it generates a predictable income stream. For business owners, they may want the security of owning their own premises, so they may buy their own office or warehouse, or wherever they need. But for individual investors like you and I, dear listener, well, there's a few reasons. As we've said, tenants have to leave it in a condition they found it. You've got those longer tenancy agreements. It offers you a bit of diversification. Something we've not said, but is really important, is that there's less competition when you buy. There's not going to be as many people viewing these properties and trying to pick them up. You can also do interesting things with commercial property. Listen to the end because we're going to tell you more about that. And you can hold it in your pension, which we'll come to shortly.
So as we've hinted at earlier in the episode, there are ways of getting exposure to commercial property that are different from just buying a particular unit. You can get indirect exposure to a broader range of commercial property through a REIT, which is a real estate investment trust, or some kind of fund. So these differ, they're structured in lots of different ways, but effectively a fund will own a whole load of commercial property. They might own shopping centres and retail parks and office blocks and all sorts, then you'll buy into that fund and just own a tiny slice of all of it. So you can never afford to buy that stuff on your own, but you can have a small piece of it. So you get that diversification across lots of different buildings and areas and types of property, and without having to lump everything into just one single building. That's something that Pete Matthew from Meaningful Money talked about when he came onto the Ask Rob and Rob podcast earlier in the year. So go and search out those episodes if you'd like to know a little bit more about that. If you do want to own commercial property directly, then one interesting thing you can do is buy it within your pension. So a pension can't hold residential property. Absolutely can't be done. But your pension can buy commercial property, and you can even borrow to a limited extent as well, so you can get some leverage. So the benefit of that, of course, is that any tax that's due on the income and the gains is deferred until you're actually drawing down on that pension. That's something that some people can find very attractive, and it's an option that's unique to commercial property because you can't do it with residential. But you don't have to do that, of course. You can just buy individual commercial units in your own name or through a company, exactly like you would with a residential property. And just like with residential property, you can buy with cash or you can get a mortgage. But there are some differences with the way that commercial property needs to be financed.
Yes, let's look at mortgages because typically they are repayment mortgages, like you would on your own residential home, not interest only, which is common with buy-to-let. You'll also expect to get a lower loan-to-value. Loan-to-value being the percentage of the loan versus the value of the property than residential as well. And rates tend to be higher. So you have lower loan-to-value and higher rates. But it's important to understand that the pricing and criteria is far more individual. It depends on the property, the quality of the tenant, your experience, and the area. It's not a pick a product off the shelf and away you go. Lenders understandably prefer the property to be tenanted, but bridging finance is available, so you could bridge the purchase, get it tenanted, and then refinance.
So if commercial property sounds like it might be something for you, let's talk about how to get started. How do you actually find commercial property to buy? Well, largely, it's the same as residential. So there's auctions. You get special commercial property auctions, but then you also get some commercial property mixed in with residential auctions often as well. There's the portals, like Rightmove. They have dedicated commercial property sections. And there's agents. There's specialist commercial property agents. You won't generally find agents who do residential and commercial. They're very, very different in the way that agents approach them. And just like there are specialist agents, there are specialist websites as well. So two of those are MoveHut and PropertyLink.
Now, Rob and I often talk about how you shouldn't limit yourself and you should be able to invest anywhere in the country. Well, this may be because of our lack of experience, but also because most people don't have the experience. You probably want to stick to areas you know, because it's harder to gauge demand and pricing. We've talked multiple times how you can assess an area for a buy-to-let from your desktop. It's harder to do with commercial property. And you won't be surprised to hear that you should probably start small. Maybe a shop with a flat above. If you're brand new, you may not want to buy a whole industrial park.
And one thing that's absolutely the same as residential property is the importance of building the right team. Having the right solicitor and the right valuer are, if anything, even more important than with residential property, especially if it's something that you have less of an intrinsic understanding of. Trying to make sense of a residential lease is hard enough, and putting a value on a residential property isn't an easy thing to do either. But with commercial, it's even more difficult. So having the right professionals around you to give you some guidance is absolutely critical.
So this very much is the beginner's guide to property, and hopefully now you've got more confidence to hold a conversation on commercial property, and if it's of interest to you, dig down with your research a little further. But don't worry, for those individuals, we've got your back, because next week we're going to go into expert mode. We've got the wonderful Phil Stewardson back on the Property Podcast. Phil has been on the podcast before. What he hasn't done in commercial property probably isn't worth knowing. He's going to be back on next week to take us up a few levels and hopefully make us all experts.
So we've still got a couple of minutes left in the show to squeeze in Hub Extra. That's coming up in just a minute. But we always take the time to acknowledge and thank someone who's taken the time to leave us a review on iTunes. So Rob, who have we got this week?
This week, Rob, we've got two wonderful hubbers. First up is Rob Mack. What a wonderful name. His review says, the latest Rob and Rob addict. Recently graduated, I have been looking forward to sending my money straight into property as soon as possible. Rob and Rob's energy and enthusiasm for property is infectious throughout all their podcasts, and so far each episode I've managed to listen to. The podcast has been full of great information and fun learning. A priceless resource to say the least. And P. Mac says, I have been listening since the start and it's taken me until now to leave a review. I didn't want it to be shamed by either Rob asking me if I'd left the review at the next meetup. The content is always topical and well thought through. It covers a balanced viewpoint. Keep up the great work, guys. Well, thank you for your great work and leaving us reviews. We remain the most popular business podcast because of you. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reviews now. Over 800, I think, in fact. And that is all down to you making the effort, getting onto iTunes and leaving your thoughts. And thankfully, the vast majority of those thoughts are positive and friendly. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, Hub Extra time now, where in every episode we squeeze in a little bit extra, whether it's a tool, a quote, or a recommendation of some kind. Today we've got a book which is the perfect follow-on from what we've just been talking about, because it's a book all about commercial property. It's called Planet Property, and it's by Peter Bill, who was the editor for a long time of the Estates Gazette, which is the main commercial property publication. Thank you to Matt for letting me know about this one. It's really, really interesting because he covers the period between 1997 and 2012, during which time there was an enormous boom in commercial property and an equally enormous bust. It was a really interesting period of time to be writing about property, and coming into reading it as somebody who didn't really know too much about this sector, it was really eye-opening because the parallels with residential property are really interesting, but then so are the differences, the way that the sector functions, the way it's made up, the personalities involved, and the way that it interacts with politics and finance are all very, very different. And it wasn't something I knew a lot about before reading the book. So if what we've talked about today has whetted your appetite a little bit and you want to learn more about commercial property as a sector, this book is a fantastic place to start.
So for those heading to a Property Hub meetup tonight, have fun. I know you will. It's such a great group of people. And if it's your first one, wow, well done you for taking action. We love your feedback, whether it's in the form of reviews, jumping on the Property Hub forum, or just engaging through us through our social media channels. Whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, our handles for all of those are Property Hub UK. Get involved, say hello. Believe it or not, we're a friendly bunch. And all that activity should tie you over till our next podcast, which is coming on Tuesday, which is Ask Rob and Rob. And of course, we're back with the Property Podcast next Thursday, where we are joined by the wonderful Phil Stewartson. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.